It's not as if God couldn't have found someone a little better than Moses, but instead God called Moses, limps, imperfections, and all, to show that all-surpassing power is from God and not from him. King David is another one of those heroes of the faith, one of the most revered heroes of the faith, and yet shortly after he was anointed king by the prophet Samuel, he became a wanted fugitive. He was hunted down by King Saul and forced to hide in caves. And then he went on to have a son through a notorious series of sins that included coveting, adultery, abuse of power, and murder. And yet, in the face of David's weakness and sin, God accomplished his purposes. You might recall the Apostle Paul famously complaining in the Bible of his thorn in his flesh. Some scholars think that might have been poor eyesight, but regardless of what it was, we have to remember that this is a man who was afflicted in some way, and that prior to his miraculous conversion to the faith on the road to Damascus, he was notorious as the most active persecutor of Christians in the entire Roman world. And let's not forget the apostles, handpicked by Jesus himself, and all of their not-so-hidden flaws. It was those same apostles who argued with each other constantly about who would be the greatest among them in heaven. It was the same apostles who constantly worried about whether they would have enough to eat. And it was the apostles who abandoned Jesus and fled when he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And yet it was these unlikely heroes that God used to establish the church on the day of Pentecost. George Whitefield, the most famous open-air preacher of the 18th century, was reputed to be able to project his voice as far as a mile. And yet, he was said to be physically weak, to have problems with his lungs. And it's said that he filled his teenage years with lying, cheating, evil speaking, and theft. This is an evangelist. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, was plagued by a lifetime of self-doubt and failed social interactions. On his first missionary journey to the United States, he experienced complete failure in everything he tried to do. And that failure as a missionary was compounded by his failed wooing of Sophie Hopke, a woman he met on the voyage from England. And on the advice of a friend, we don't exactly know why, he abruptly called off the engagement while on his missionary journey. And then when Sophie came to church that Sunday, he refused to serve her communion. That dispute escalated eventually into a civil suit, and it led to the tarnishing of John Wesley's reputation and a quite humiliating end to his first ever missionary effort. Even Mother Teresa, one of the most revered figures in world history, bore that treasure of God in a jar of clay. Pastor Mark has spoken before of some of Teresa's wrestlings with her faith and her self-doubt. But she also struggled mightily with the temptation to return to the comfort and the safety of life in the convent rather than the ministry on the streets. Yet somehow God used that frailty of her body and her faith and the frailty of her resolve to bless and inspire millions, if not billions, of people. If you were here last week, you might remember that Pastor Mark asked you, "What's your story?" He said that we all have stories about how God is at work in the small parts and the big parts of our lives. So this week I'm asking you a slightly different question. What's your limp? What are the things in your life that slow you down, that distract you, that weigh on your mind and wear on your body? Because we all have them, In fact, The limps that we have are almost always a part of the stories that we have to tell. God allows us our limps to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. So think about that a bit. What's your limp? Increasingly, it seems to me that the limp of all our world is related to money. The unemployment rate in Minnesota jumped from 5.1% in March of 2008 to 8.5% in March of 2009. There were 26,000 foreclosures in Minnesota in 2008, which is an increase of nearly 6,000 foreclosures from the previous year. The top 3 counties with the highest foreclosure numbers in Minnesota in 2008 were Hennepin, Ramsey, and Anoka counties, right here, with Anoka County alone responsible for over 2,000 foreclosures. That's a 36% increase over 2007. Many of us limp with fractured families, and divorce continues to cripple both adults and children. In 2004, there were about 2.25 million marriages in the United States, and of that number, about half as many divorces that same year. That's over 3,000 divorces for every day of the year. The only reason I think that there aren't even more divorces is that fewer and fewer people are even bothering to get married at all. Others of us limp with mental disabilities. An estimated 26% of Americans 18 and older, that's about 1 in 4 adults, suffer from some diagnosable mental disorder in any given year. In 2004, that translated to over 57 million people. Mental disorders are the leading cause of disability in the United States and Canada for people ages 15 to 44. Depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, anxiety, eating disorders, autism, and ADHD can be crippling yet hidden burdens that limit and shape the way we try to cope with ordinary life. Drug and alcohol abuse are also often hidden impairments in our midst, with methamphetamine the latest scourge to ravage our society. The Anoka County Meth Task Force estimates that in 2004, 5% of all ninth graders in the state of Minnesota had tried meth. That's 1 out of every 20, and yes, that's ninth graders. Meth addiction can occur after 1 or 2 tries with no guarantee of recovery. Physical and mental damage can be severe, resulting in lifetime impairment or death. Meth use is often associated with stealing, violence, and domestic abuse. Wow. So where do we go from here? We are, all of us in this church, in this city, in this community, and in this world, ready to check into the hospital. Some of us are hurting so much we need to be in the emergency room. The burdens that we're carrying, whether they're visible on the outside or not, are just too heavy for us to carry around. So how can it be that it's us that Jesus has asked to enlist in his boot camp? How could it possibly be that Jesus wants us to be the salt and the light of the world? It really doesn't seem to make sense when we look at things from our own eyes. And to make any sense of it all, we have to go back to God's Word and seek some kind of encouragement there. And that's exactly what Paul offers to the church in Corinth. And it's exactly what he offers to us today. To explain that even though it's hard, we are called to live in this difficult tension between being broken people and being people on a mission, between being wards of a hospital and recruits in a boot camp.